40.
You were wondering by what year?
Strong Side Podcast.
Merely adopted.
Brought to you by Strong Side.
Come after me. I'm a man. I'm 40.
I don't really know what I say to the players when I'm on the field. I just know that I'm out there trying to coach. Hey, this is Mark and Doug has been a head coach for, I forgot, like 9?
8. Just
8.
finished my 8th season this past fall.
8 years, and we're going to talk about what it's like becoming a new head coach, what you need to know as a head coach, what you'd want to know for prepping for an interview, moving from one state to another or one school to another. And so with that, why don't you give an intro where you're at now, how long you were at Thunder Ridge before?
Yeah, so I spent 6 years as the head coach at Thunder Ridge in Highlands Ranch, Colorado, and then left there and came to Scottsdale, Arizona, where I was the head coach at Chaparral for the last 2 seasons. And then prior to Thunder Ridge, I was an assistant for 9 years, 4 of those being at Thunder Ridge. So 17, 18 years all in coaching experience.
So this is, oddly enough to me, one of the most common questions I see on like social media or posts or whatever head coaching group I'm in is probably once a week, maybe twice a week, there's someone who says, hey, how did you guys get your jobs as like assistants or head coaches, or how would I get a head coaching job, or how would I get an assistant coaching job, or why doesn't anybody want to hire me as an assistant, whatnot? And for me, I don't know how to answer those questions. It's surprising to me because at least where I am in my life, like since I've coached, it's like, well, we don't really pay these guys much, so we'll take almost anybody who's a nice person who knows football, right? I've coached at my alma mater and with you, but I mean, you're aware there's probably 5 high schools nearby. If I said, hey, I'm looking for a place to coach, they'd find me a spot, right? So finding a place to coach.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of starts with being willing to do any job when you're first starting out. I think that's something people try and rush into, young coaches try and rush into, getting the point where they call plays or something like that. How many years have I been coaching? I was probably in my 8th season, 7th or 8th season before I called a play at the varsity level. So being willing to do any job to get your foot in the door. And then also it's always about connections. I mean, what got me back at Thunder Ridge as an assistant was my connection with the coach there at the time, which was my coach, Joe Johnson. And then it kind of became a right place, right time thing for me, where he was leaving, taking another position. And for the first time really ever, Thunder Ridge was struggling, and it kind of opened the door for me, even though I was young. So I would say being willing to do anything, using your connections, but then also some of it is going to be right place, right time. You know, you might wind up in a good program, doing a great job, but maybe there's not a lot of turnover with their coordinators, with their head coach, with things like that. And some of those opportunities just may not come at that place. So you have to decide, do you want to take a leap of faith on somewhere new to try and, take that next step and get a coordinator role or call plays. So those are all kind of things to consider. But learn
so somewhere new.
Possibly can, because as a head coach, you have to know so much more.
Yeah, so we'll come back to talking about becoming a head coach or trying to get a head coaching job. You mentioned somewhere new. So you would have advice for coaches. You've actually gone to a lot of different places. Obviously, since we've coached together, it's really only been one change. But I always forget, prior to coaching together with you, you were at a couple spots. So moving to something new, advice and thoughts, and for both as an assistant and as a head coach, and then also as changing regions, states, divisions, whatever it might be.
Yeah, I mean, my coaching career started with my first 4 years. I was at 4 schools. Now, I was only with 2 coaching staffs. It just so happened that connections, people that I knew, moved, went somewhere else, and I followed them. But yeah, so I spent the first 2 years, I was at 2 different schools in Arizona, at Tempe and at Sandra Day O'Connor, and then I went to North Carolina, and I coached at Northern Durham, and then I coached at Millbrook. In both those cases, it was a coach leaving and kind of taking me with them. So coming back to that connections piece, that was kind of how I wound up at a different school, even though there were similarities on the staff. But I'm sorry, what was the second part of the question?
So, advice if you're transitioning from, let's go with just advice if you're transitioning from a different state, and we'll do that as a head coach because I think that's the most interesting to people. So you went from Colorado to Arizona 2 years ago, right? I think
Yeah,
whenever we talk about it, it feels like a lifetime ago, but it was. So you've been there 2 years.
2 years.
You had some items that I've forgotten about till we were talking recently. You were going back and forth for like 3 months, like 2 weeks here, 1 week there, and
Yeah, for
then
a little while. For 2.5 months. Yeah,
yeah.
I spent 2 weeks in Colorado and then a week in Arizona. And I would say the biggest thing, and this isn't always possible, I don't think it should scare people away. But if you have an opportunity, if you're moving out of state and you're coming from, if you're coming from a situation where you can't leave immediately and go be there in person, definitely pay some attention throughout your interview process into like how that's going to be managed.
Mhm.
And it's not that, through that process, anybody did anything wrong to me down here. It's just really, you got to really think about all the little things
Mhm.
that you are miss out on by not being there immediately. I mean, my first parent meeting that had anything to do with actual details, I had to do over a Zoom.
Oh,
So,
really? Okay.
yeah, so it presents limitations. And then the hardest part is, even though I had been down there and I'd got to work with some of the kids and we did, we had to do spring practice in 1 week that year. So we did Monday through Saturday, we did 6 straight days. But even though I got to work with the kids, not being around all the time makes it hard to really like build the relationships and connect. And then you get down there in June and everything's about football right away because it has to be, because
Right.
you're 2 months away, 2.5 months away
Yeah.
from playing the game. And the downside about that, especially when you struggle in that first season, is in those hardest moments. When I look back at some of the years we had at Thunder Ridge where that weren't as successful, what we always kind of had to fall back on was relationships.
Mhm.
And that does a lot for a group of people and for a team, especially when the chips are down and things aren't going your way. And it's tough to be brutally honest with people and to coach people hard and to expect them to respond to you in a certain way when that relationship piece just isn't fully developed yet. I'm really grateful. I had some kids in that senior group my first year at Chaparral, which was a difficult season. One comes to mind, a kid who's at Colorado State now playing, Keegan Shank, who I think he understood that. And I think he made just as much of an effort as myself or any coach to try and foster those connections. And I'm grateful for that because it was voices like his that you need to survive in times like that. So I would just
Mhm.
encourage people really, really dive into not just the operations, because I thought a lot about operations, right? Okay, how can I
Mhm.
make sure someone's there to meet with college coaches, getting the schedules out, doing all that type of stuff, working on solidifying a coaching staff during that time. You think about all those things,
Right.
and then some of the big overarching themes like relationship development just kind of get pushed to the wayside because you can't focus on it as much. So, I wish I had done more from a distance. I don't know that it would have made a huge difference, but more from a distance that didn't just have to do with football. We did some Zoom stuff and we went back and forth, send in film clips and stuff of what the offense to look like. But again, it was all football stuff. And I think
Right.
even though and two was still very difficult and we were a really young team and an inexperienced team again, it felt completely different because that relationships piece was there. So I just would say, really consider how you're going to manage all aspects because it's a really difficult thing to do from distance, especially going to a place where you may not have that many coaches in the building. If you do, you don't know any of them. You don't have anybody you can trust.
Right.
And that was kind of the part. I had so many guys I could trust in Colorado and so many things I could delegate to people and not think a second time about. And you lose that ability completely.
Right. So one thing we talked about a little bit is interviewing as a head coach. The key questions that come up, and it was interesting to me. We talked a little bit about this. Is there's almost always, or is always, some questions on when what would you call those situations? Like bad situations. Kids have done something wrong. Substance abuse, discipline items
type
like
situations.
that. So those things are, I think, I mean, you've done well, I think, anytime you've been interviewing for head coaching positions, at least historically, from what I've heard you say about them. What advice and what questions are the hardest?
First of all, I think the hardest thing about it is people really probably, unless you've gone for it, you've been a part of it, you don't really understand how intense it is. I mean, you meet with usually multiple panels of people. I did one of them during COVID where I had to sit in an auditorium on the stage while people were spaced throughout the room. So, it's a daunting process. It takes hours. It's usually 2 or 3 rounds long. So you're talking about, 2.5, 3+ hours of interviewing by the time it's done, because it's a massive undertaking. So I would say, one of the big things is be prepared to field questions about, how you would handle a hypothetical difficult situation with a parent, or a discipline situation with the kid, or a difficult situation with the teacher, things like that. Make sure you have an answer for it. But also know your audience. The people, in my experience, through the 3 head coaching interviews processes I've been through, and, got 2 of those jobs, made it to the final round of the other one. You have to understand that not everybody you're going to sit in front of is somebody who has a lot of football knowledge, or maybe even understands anything about football.
Right.
So you need to be prepared to speak concisely about your football specific plans, your actual schemes, your philosophies as it relates to what systems you're going to run. But you also have to make sure you don't lose people in that, because when you're sitting in at least the initial round committee, you're going to have an athletic director who may or may not have a football background. Usually, if it's not a total gut job on the coaching staff, you'll get an assistant coach that's in the building that they'll put on it. You'll usually get some head coach in the building of another major sport. You'll usually get another assistant coach. You'll usually get a teacher that doesn't coach anything. Sometimes you'll get another administrator who may or may not have a sports background. And then you'll usually get a couple parents, members of the booster club, parent volunteers, team moms, things like that. So if you dive way too deep into the nitty gritty details of how you're going to teach your zone blocking footwork, you're going to lose a lot of the people that have the power to pass you on to the next round. And eventually you're going to sit down with football people, or at least people who want to hear football answers. And at that point in time is when you can dive deeper. If you find yourself on a committee that is heavily football, go for it. When I interviewed at Grandview, there was a second smaller committee that was made up of assistant football coaches and players. So I spoke a lot more about like what we were actually going to do on the field philosophically, schematically with that group than I did in the other section of the interview. So you got to kind of read the room and be prepared to talk about what things, think about it. What does a parent want to hear? What does a parent want to know about? What is a teacher who's really maybe not that interested in football? What do they want to know the football coach is going to do for them, or for their colleagues, or for the school? Obviously the athletic director, what he's looking for kind of speaks for itself. But you've got to be able to connect with all those different groups. Players as well might be sitting on that committee. So you got to make sure you hit on the topics that you want to connect with all those people, because generally a first round committee is going to ask you 8, 10, 12 questions, and you're not going to get to answer for longer than, a minute on each question, minute and a half on each question. So you got to make sure you're never going to be able to talk about your entire program plan, not in round 1 at least. There's not enough time. So you got to make sure that you know everything you want to discuss, so that when you see who's on that committee, you can kind of cherry pick what people are most interested in knowing about you, because those are the people that you have to win over to get to the next round, where you might get to dive in deeper.
Right. Let's talk about being the best coach as a head coach, right? We discussed a little bit prior to this, this idea that you have to remember you're the best coach, not in an arrogant way, but go ahead and explain that philosophy a little bit and ways that it's impacted you and the programs you're a part of.
Yeah, it was advice I got from my old head coach, who's obviously been a longtime mentor of mine, Joe Johnson. He told me that when I took over at Thunder Ridge. Um,
Joe
you
does
know,
believe he's the best coach, though. So
Joe is.
he
So
probably is.
doesn't
True.
he
Yeah.
doesn't need to
He
believe
doesn't
it,
believe it.
because trust me, you sit down and talk
Yeah,
ball with that guy.
on a football field. Yeah.
Yeah, but what I always loved about Joe though is shoot, when I was, God, how old was I? Yeah, I was maybe 24, 25 when he kind of let me take charge of redesigning Thunder Ridge's defense into an odd front. And so he's one of those guys where, like, he's got his beliefs because he's done it for so long and he's seen it. But like, if you can show him something that fits what he believes in, like he'll roll with it. I mean, that whole defensive redo kind of came from that. So, but
Yeah.
he gave a lot of advice to me when I took over at Thunder Ridge. But one of the things that stuck out to me, that he actually reminded me several times when I talked to him while I was at Shap and I was struggling with different decisions. And he said, remember that you're always your best coach on your staff. You're always the best coach on your staff. And what he meant by that isn't necessarily that, your football acumen and strategizing is so superior to everyone else's that no one on your staff could ever know more than you. It's really a mantra to keep in the back of your head, to remember that when it comes to decisions that you're going to make about your program, you are the best coach on your staff, because nobody else on your staff, no matter how much coaching experience they have, no matter how long they've been in that program, none of them touch as many different things around the program as the head coach does. So you're always going to have more information and more insight than any other coach on your staff. Doesn't mean you don't seek out opinions. I did that all the time. I was have a guy named Casey Paul, who'd been a head wrestling coach for a decade plus, 15 years, 20 years at the time that he started.
20 years. Yeah.
And so I always leaned on him for those types of things. But when it comes down to it, when you're struggling to make a choice, whatever you are feeling, go with it, because nobody else knows your program better than you do as a head coach. And it's really easy to forget that sometimes, especially when you go into a new place and there's people there who have been there and who understand that place better than you. You still have to remember that your name's on it. Their name is not, good or bad. So in that regard, you're always the best coach on your staff when it comes to making decisions about your program. No one else is ever gonna have more insight than you.
So, as a new head coach, I don't think it's terrible working with parents. It's become actually worse to watch parents now that I am a parent, to just see like the amount of delusional and the desire to avoid discomfort for your children. But as a head coach for the whole program, what do you think would have been more valuable to know, 8-10 years ago, going into becoming a head coach? And what did you have to kind of learn on the job that went poorly or went well?
I think, first of all, in general, you never fully understand all the things you have to do until you've done it. So, everything I did goal was to become a head coach. So, that was always in the back of my mind all the time.
Right.
And in those types of instances, sorry, heard my kid.
That's what we're talking about.
Yeah. So I just totally broke my train of thought. Sorry. Get me back.
You have to do everything as a head coach. You were always.
Oh, thank you. So
you
never know.
And then
you can't possibly. So what I was saying is everything I did prepared was aimed at that. And then I was even fortunate enough to go. He let me come to league meetings and kind of see how that works, and CHASA meetings, and start to understand how the how the governing body worked and how they changed.
You had someone who was encouraging of learning and
he knew that was the goal of mine, and he wanted to help me do that. I got to meet with college coaches and start helping them out with some recruiting stuff. And so I think that I probably had more of a lens into some of that stuff than a lot of people get to have. And it's still, you can't possibly prepare for it. So you just got to understand that going in, that like, no matter how well you do, wins, losses, or otherwise, it's going to be an overwhelming experience, because you just can't even fathom all the different things that you're in charge of. But coming back to your piece about parents, I think that a big thing is educating. I'll start with recruiting. I think that's one of the most important things. And overall, it's gotten younger and younger now, to where you see kids in middle school and elementary school talking about scholarships. So by the time it gets to the high school level, I mean, it's
ridiculous.
It's important. And the recruiting game's changed a ton. And I mean, at some point in time, we probably got to do an episode about that in general, and get a college coach on and talk to them about it. But from my perspective as a high school coach, it's changed everything. I mean, it's so much harder for high school kids to get recruited now. And I don't think parents understand the process, and why should or would they, right, if they're not involved in it. So I think a big part of the job, I think a big part of the job now too is trying to educate parents on not just processes like recruiting, but also expectations. I've had lots of really good football players that are overlooked because they don't have the height, because they don't have this. Metrics are a huge thing. And if you're undersized, you better jump off the screen at something else, right? If you're going to be a 5'9" outside receiver trying to play at the next level, man, you better have a massive vertical, and you better be able to run. And they're still probably going to try and move you inside if you get to that level. So people don't understand, you look at the size it takes to play up front. I mean, I've had kids that are 6'5", 6'6", get recruited and not be as good of football players as other kids I had on that same team. But you can't teach a kid to
they got the frame.
Yeah, you can't teach a kid to have a frame that you can put, a 320, you can get to 325 pounds. So those things matter a lot. And I don't think people always understand that outside of, where they played their youth ball and where they're playing their high school ball, there's a lot more. Adam Marcelletta talks a lot about when he first started really trying to attack college football and eventually trying to play professionally. And he mentioned to the guy that trained him that, part of why he wanted to go play at the next level was he was the best player in his school and in his region. He was the player of the year. And the guy was like, well, what's that matter toward playing college football? And his point was not that obviously he couldn't go do it, that's what everybody is at the next level. Everybody playing major D1 football was an all-state or multi player with conference player of the year accolades and all kinds of stuff like that. That's why they say the top 1%, 1 point whatever percent. So I think that's a big thing, trying to educate parents on those things and manage those expectations. But you also have to have a plan. You can't shut parents out in this day and age. I think the old school mentality was that we just close the door. And for guys who have been established for decades and have been winning, they can probably do that. I don't think Dave Logan spends too much time, but I have talked to him about some parent things he's dealt with before. So nobody from it. And I think you have to have a good plan for, what do you talk to people about? How do you give them access to you, and what do you give them access to you for? I'd always say to parents, if you need to talk about your kids' emotional well-being, academic well-being, psychological well-being, doors open, all and any time. You want to talk about your kids' playing time, different story. Now we got a process to go through, and it's going to start with your kid, right? And then we work our way up. So you got to have a plan for that too, because I think if you go too extreme in either direction, you run very different risks of kind of losing the group.
So probably one of our last questions, what's an experience as a head coach that you have, or most head coaches would have, that an assistant coach wouldn't have? A good experience, not a bad experience.
Oh, okay. That an assistant coach wouldn't have?
Yeah.
I mean, honestly, I really think it comes back. I hope it's not too generic of an answer, but I really think it just comes back to all the details that you have to manage. And I think that's what sometimes when it comes to, coaching candidates who have experience or more experience versus ones that don't, I think it comes down.
Let me rephrase the question a little bit.
Oh, okay.
As an assistant coach, you'll never experience having the official record of a great season, right? Like, as an assistant coach, I've never actually officially won a varsity game where someone says, well, my name's under it, right? And my guess is the answer that you're going to say is the best thing, or at least in my mind, the thing that I would expect and think is probably the best, is you have a deeper relationship just by the title with all of the players on the team than any assistant coach would have. Regardless, you just can't be the head coach. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
My guess is what it is rewarding that a head coach would have that an assistant coach doesn't.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's definitely one thing. I mean, you don't get to, as an assistant coach, even if you're a coordinator and assistant head coach, generally you're only working with about half the team. Now that, that can vary, obviously, schools where everybody plays both ways and, make it a little bit different, but on a large school football team as a coach, generally you don't get to interact with more than maybe half the kids. It could be a lot less than that, right? If you just coach quarterbacks, it's 3 or 4 kids, you get to know the receivers, you get to know other kids. But that's probably the coolest thing that you get to experience. And then also you get to kind of get an inside view at some of the really fun stuff and the exciting stuff for kids. Their recruiting processes when it does go the way that they're wanting it to go, and that offer comes through, school, that opportunity that they wanted comes through, and it's really exciting. And as an assistant coach, sometimes you get to be involved in that if you're close with the player and they kind of keep you involved, but not at the same way you do when you're working in the building and you're there every day. Those are some of my best memories, is watching guys go sign to play in college and getting wedding invitations and things like that.
Yeah. All right. So you could wave a magic wand and be great at any coaching role in any sport. Obviously can't be football. It'd be great if you were really good at that. And you want to become what kind of coach? What sport or activity?
I would say, like, if I could wave a magic wand, just because obviously if I'm coaching something, I have some level of skill and knowledge about it, and I really need to be a better golfer and golf more. So I think I'd say golf, but also because I've only ever coached football and track, and both of those roles are large teams. I was the JV coach for our track team for 2 years, but it's still a lot of kids. I've never worked with athletes in a setting where it's like a small number or even one
or whatever
extended period of time. So I think that would be cool, because you just get to, you get to know someone on a completely different level when your team is 6 people versus 106 people.
So I think that's it. Wanted to cover who we're going to talk with. Obviously you and I will be here for pretty much all of them, so you're done, and we'll do one with me. Who else are we going to talk to? I've got ones that I'm excited about.
Yeah, I'm excited about you're wearing his hat. I'm always excited to fight.
That's not fair, because that was going to be the one I wanted to be excited about.
Oh, well, I'm sorry I stole it. But yeah, head baseball coach for, I don't even know how many years. I ask him all the time and he has to remind me, but a lot of years.
Oh yeah.
A lot. Successful and a long time assistant football coach. And the thing I always liked about Joe is he does, the relationships are everything to him. And that's where I've learned so much from him about perspective and things like that. So he's always got, it doesn't matter what you coach or what you do, he's always got something positive.
So Sean McGrath, we're going to talk with him. I think he's exciting because I think he has a very good and interesting and works well offensive philosophy. And the sort of proof in the pudding thing is he had a sophomore quarterback that averaged something like 250 yards a game, who was not like a D1 recruit. He's not like a kid that, or at least at the time, he was just not a kid that it was like, oh, we expect him to be great. He runs systems and offense that is very effective, and probably we'll think of some others. That's probably.
Yeah, I'd love to get like Sean Patterson's about to retire as a principal.
Oh,
He'd be a
man.
great guy. I've kind of planted the seed with him already. So, and then there's definitely some assistant coaches that I have that would be good guests to have. And I also think that I'm forgetting who I was about to bring up, so you'll have to cut that part out.
That's fine. For anybody who is hearing this is the first
McCartney,
one,
that's who we need to talk to. Air Raid with Tom McCartney. That's what I was trying to
the goal essentially is that we don't talk about so much football scheme, but items that are related to football or coaching or process rather than. So an athletic director, a baseball coach, those ones fall in there, not because of, we want to talk about 3-4 or something, but there's plenty that.
Yeah. Well, and it's important to have perspective too. Like, you got to understand other people's roles. That's another big thing as a head coach. Like, you got to understand what your AD goes through too.
Right.
What everyone goes through.
All right, cool. Well, there we go. We're done.
Hey, you're going up by 1 year.
Strong Side Podcast. Brought to you by Strong Side.
Come after me. I'm a man. I'm 40.
I don't really know what I say to the players when I'm on the field. I just know that I'm out there trying to coach.